Mhm. Good morning. Welcome back to the Vitality Project. I'm Dr. Bob. Yesterday, we clarified two very different approaches to scientific understanding. The first, as we discussed, the first approaches objects in nature, like a rock, and explores rocks, well, objectively. So it approaches objects and studies them objectively. The second examines subjects, like us humans, and examines them, can you guess? You got it. Subjectively. Natural science approaches objects and studies them objectively. The technical term for that kind of study is empiricism. You might have heard the term empirical science before. If you have, that's what it's referring to, where you look at things objectively. We don't have a good word, however, in everyday English for the second form, where we examine subjects from the inside subjectively. We discussed this over the last couple of video posts, that the Germans use a word that comes closest as translating as spiritual science, and that doesn't really register or make much sense to us in English. The technical term in English, both in philosophy and in psychology, is phenomenology. But who wants to deal with that, right? That's a pretty big mouthful. But all of this discussion, regardless of the terms or the titles or the labels that we're using, all of this brings me to the 12-step view of addiction as a spiritual problem with a spiritual solution. That's right out of the big book. And if by that what is meant is that addiction is a subjective problem, a spiritual problem equals subjective. Remember, spiritual sciences look at things subjectively. That if addiction is a subjective problem which requires a subjective science, what the Germans call Geisteswissenschaften, or spiritual science. In other words, we have to look at things experientially, or to use the technical term, phenomenologically, see, I can even pronounce it. That if addiction is a subjective problem, then it requires a subjective science for its solution. And I would completely agree with that. Just to say a little bit more about that. The subjective or inner psychological aspects underlying addictive behaviors are crucial to our understanding. This isn't to say for one moment that addiction doesn't also have an objective natural science basis as well. You know as well as I that there's a biological and medical perspective on addiction that's extremely important, completely valid, absolutely necessary. But when Bill W. and the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous nearly a century ago, and then all the other 12-step sister organizations that have been spawned by AA, when they initially underscored the spiritual and I would say subjective reasons at the root of so many addictive behaviors, including to alcohol and other drugs, Bill W. and the others, they were clearly wanting to emphasize that addiction is not simply a moral problem that only bad people get caught in. Bill W. was deeply influenced by William James, who was the first American psychologist, deeply rooted in the phenomenological tradition. In fact, his most famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, looks at religion not from the outside, but from the inside. And you can actually get that from the title, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Now, that's the focus. Bill W. was very much influenced by William James in the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. So Bill W. and the other founders were interested in moving beyond looking at addiction as only a moral problem, because up to that time, primarily, people that had gotten addicted, gotten enslaved, particularly with substance, including alcohol, were just seen as bad people. If you think about it for just a second, we can all get enslaved, which is the root word for addiction. We can all get enslaved, and you know as well as I that our inner lives, our subjective life experiences, are often right at the heart of the matter. I believe that we must examine these subjective concerns fully, which includes at a minimum exploring psychological factors, including our emotional life and our core relationships, just as much as examining spiritual resources and beliefs. And that's where the language thing matters, because spirituality, the way that we use it in contemporary English, would focus just on the spiritual dimension. And it's far too easy to leave out the psychological. But spirituality, understood the way that William James understood it and the foundations of modern psychology, a spiritual science, a spiritual understanding is inclusive of a psychological understanding. So it doesn't exclude psychology. It absolutely includes psychology right at the root. In fact, psychology is in the foundation of one's spiritual beliefs. I want you to come back tomorrow, and I want to say a little bit more about spirituality itself. And I look forward to taking this even a little bit further. I want to thank you for joining me today. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a wonderful day today.